Woman wears her mother's old ring for 25 years. She screams when the jeweler tells her this. Life's not always easy. It's like a roller coaster with occasional ups and downs. Unfortunately, some people have it worse than others out of no fault of their own. Lydia's a 50-year-old woman and is happily married to John. They live a somewhat regular life but are struggling financially. They can make ends meet, but the duo have to work relatively hard. And for Lydia, this isn't the only big fight she has to face in her life. Her life has been a series of difficulties. She had a difficult time growing up. Lydia was an only child and had a very good relationship with her mother Sarah, as they always had to do everything together. Her father had never really been in her life. He'd left her mother Sarah as soon as he found out that she'd become pregnant. He was not a very good example of a father, and her mom had to raise her on her own. This is never easy for any single mom. But despite the absence of her dad, Lydia lacked nothing during her childhood. Raising a child can be very draining if left to a person, hence it's a two-person job. Unfortunately for Sarah, her partner was never in the picture, so she had to put in the effort for two. Lydia's whole childhood was like a battle that she fought alongside her mother. While Lydia was in school, her mother worked two jobs to support them both. When Lydia was old enough, she also managed to find a job to fill her free hours during the week. The mother-daughter duo put up an admirable and relentless fight to provide for themselves. Sarah was a wonderful and loving mother and wanted to give the best to her child. She dedicated her whole life towards ensuring her daughter would have a better one. With both mother and daughter working, they managed to put some money aside. Sarah was doing all of this for the sake of her daughter. She wanted nothing more than to give her only child the best possible life. She was a devoted mom and never complained, but one day the unthinkable happened. Putting in this much effort has a price, and Sarah paid for that price with her health. Her body could no longer keep up with the fast-paced rhythm she'd imposed on it. Sarah suddenly fell very ill when Lydia was about 24 years old. She was rushed to the hospital where the doctors struggled to determine what was wrong. Fortunately, Sarah's condition deteriorated by the day. The disease had taken hold of Sarah, and after a few weeks, it was clear Sarah wasn't going to survive. It was a very difficult time for Lydia, as she had to say goodbye to her mom. Sarah had devoted her whole life to the happiness of her only daughter. Sadly, she passed on when Lydia was only 25. She didn't live long enough to see her daughter marry and start a family. It was extremely difficult for Lydia to get through this period. Being an only child and the only family member who seemed to care, she had a lot of things she needed to take care of. The only reason she managed to make it all happen was with some help from her boyfriend John. They'd only been together for a few months, but John had showed himself to be the perfect man. Lydia couldn't believe it. Her devoted mother was gone. Although she was still reeling from the loss, she knew that she had to stay strong and take the necessary steps following her mother's death. After Lydia's mother passed away, she had a lot of papers she needed to sort out. The funeral was the first thing she needed to organize. It was a sober farewell with only a few close friends and relatives. Sarah didn't have much time in her life for friends, but she had a few very good ones. It's true that parents usually leave this world before their children, but Lydia was still too young for this. Goodbyes are never easy, and Lydia learned this lesson the most brutal way. Her mother was all she had in the world, so it was extremely painful when she had to say goodbye. Even though it was painful though, Lydia managed to say goodbye satisfying. She was still upset about the whole situation, but she was starting to make peace with herself bit by bit. She just needed time to grieve and move on with her life without Sarah by her side. Unfortunately, she wasn't prepared for what was to come next. After Lydia had finished taking care of the funeral, she now had to take care of her mom's inheritance. This is despite the fact she didn't seem to have much to her name. Sarah wasn't rich at all, but before her death, she made sure to document everything she owned. This would ensure everything was left to Lydia. But it turned out to be more of a burden than a blessing because Sarah didn't have much. It was then that Lydia realized everything her dear mother had done for her. She couldn't hold back her tears. Sarah didn't own her house. She lived in rent all her life. She'd barely saved any money. In fact, her savings were even less than Lydia imagined. This was because Sarah had given Lydia almost everything she owned when she moved out. The realization made Lydia even sadder. Her mom had literally sacrificed everything for her. Lydia decided to tidy up her mother's house. She started by separating the things she wanted to keep and the things she wouldn't be able to. Many of the items left in the house included furniture and clothing. Almost all went to charitable donations. Lydia just kept a few items for herself. She found a few items she wanted to keep which were sentimental value. Among these was an old ring her mother loved to wear, but Lydia never knew why. Sarah herself didn't have an easy childhood. That's why she did everything to make her only daughter's life better than the one she'd lived. Sarah made sure her daughter had everything. Lydia knew the ring had a story behind it, but she'd never really paid attention to it. Her mother always told her she'd stolen it when she was just a little girl. When Sarah was only 12, she had a job cleaning the houses of wealthy people, but one of the women who employed her was really rude and mean, and not just with her words. Nowadays, this sort of thing wouldn't have gone unpunished. Someone would have reported it to the authorities. Child abuse is illegal and severely punished, verbal or physical. She used to hit Sarah whenever she did something that wasn't satisfying, and sadly that happened quite often. Sarah needed the money, so when she finally got another house to work in, she quickly quit the job, but not before stealing a ring she found on her last day of work. It was her way of revenge. Lydia found this to be a very thoughtful gift from her mother, so she decided to wear it all the time from then on. That way she'd always be close to her mom every step of her life. Sarah always wore the ring proudly as a memento of when she was defending herself, and now Lydia would wear it as a memento of her mother. Almost all the other things she kept from her mother either disappeared in the drawers or garage or were sold after a while. Nonetheless, she still had something that she'd wear all the time. Lydia always found the theft story quite strange, so she never really paid attention to it because it didn't matter. All she knew was that it was a part of her mother that she'd wear from then on. This story of the ring had always seemed far-fetched. She never saw her mother as the time to do something against the rules, even at such a young and ignorant age. Her mom had always shown her the right values. But what Lydia didn't know yet was that she was about to find out a lot more about her mother. Throughout this tragedy, Lydia had been able to count on someone to help her through the difficult time. He's the kind of man her mom deserved to have in her life. Lydia had to move on after the passing of her mother, and fortunately she still had John. Although they probably had the most trying months of their relationship, the worst possible time, they ended up staying together. All these trials helped them come together. John supported Lydia and they became closer in many ways. Their relationship evolved a lot. Despite the loss of her mom, Lydia could always count on John, so it's no surprise they decided to start a family together. Lydia was convinced John was the man of her life. Less than a year after Sarah passed away, the couple had their first child, Sammy. Lydia quickly discovered having a baby was the best way to fill the void her mother had left. The things she'd tried before getting pregnant were a lot less healthy. It was also a new start for her and John. They were going to share the happiness of being parents. Everyone has their own way of dealing with the bereavement of a loved one. Being only 25 when she lost her mother, Lydia wasn't well equipped to handle it. In the first few months following the death of her mother, Lydia turned to alcohol. It was starting to become so serious it affected other areas of her life, so the pregnancy was a blessing in more ways than one. Lydia immediately gave up the bottle when she heard the news, but now she had to find a new lifestyle to avoid affecting her unborn child. Like any other addiction, it's very difficult to give up alcohol. Lydia had immersed herself in it to manage her pain, but when she discovered she was pregnant, she knew she had to quit. Lydia had a tendency of turning to alcohol whenever a wave of sadness washed over her. At this point, she'd drink even when the sadness was unrelated to her mother's passing. She was unable to deal with her emotions. Fortunately, she found the strength to cope with this addiction. Who'd have thought that pregnancy was the solution? She knew she had no choice and that her mom wouldn't be proud of her if she saw her like this. She wanted to do everything to keep her child healthy, just like her mother had done for her. These were the most difficult months in Lydia's life. Things had been very difficult up till this point, but with the birth of their child, things finally started to improve. Lydia was able to focus all her attention on the education and welfare of her son, Sammy. So she found herself turning to the bottle less and less. Lydia and John saw their relationship grow and evolve into a family with the arrival of Sammy. Lydia was much happier in her own skin and didn't fail to express her love to the two men in her life. Over the next 2 years, life for the family was good. Sammy was growing up healthy, Lydia and John had finally saved up enough money to get married and were extremely happy. Sarah would have been a great grandmother to Sammy, so it was a shame she wasn't there anymore. Like the rest of Lydia's life, a big speed bump was about to appear. Sammy grew up in a loving home with parents who loved each other and loved him dearly. Eventually, Sammy grew up and needed some independence. By this time, Sammy was already 24 years old and ready to leave the house. It was a moment Lydia dreaded a lot. Indeed, taking care of Sammy had been her main goal in life for years, and she was afraid of what the major change in lifestyle would bring. She'd always had a hard time dealing with separation, so she was afraid of falling into bad habits again. Fortunately, Lydia was now more mature and had a lot more willpower than when she was 24. She knew this day would come and had made necessary preparations. To clear her mind, Lydia decided to go jogging that afternoon. She did this often as she was relatively fit for her age. Jogging replaced the bad habits she'd acquired in her youth. Thinking back to her alcohol-filled days, she was very proud of the way she was living now. But with her head in a cloud, she didn't pay enough attention to the path. Jogging helps clear your head and is important when keeping fit, but that day Lydia was so focused on her son leaving she didn't pay enough attention. Lydia tripped over a branch that had fallen from a tree and was now lying in the path. Luckily, Lydia had quick reflexes. She managed to put her hand in front of her to cushion her fall, but when Lydia tried to stand up, she noticed something weird and felt a wave of pain run through her body. The damage wasn't just physical. The fall was so brutal that when she tried to cushion it, she broke her mom's ring. It's true that physically she'd sustained very little damage, but this wasn't the case for her mom's ring. It was broken. The ring was still around her finger where it had been for 25 years, but it had cracked and no longer looked like a ring. Lydia felt tears build in her eyes and decided to return home immediately. She was devastated. It was the only memory left of her mom and she'd broken it. Besides being a great father, John was a handyman too. Lydia was hopeful her husband would be able to help with the ring, but John advised her to go see a jeweler instead. She hoped John would be able to fix it as he'd done with almost anything that had broken down in their house, but John was unwilling to take the risk with something that was so precious to Lydia. He advised her to take it to a jeweler to have it repaired. After all, it required specialized equipment to restore the ring to its original shape. Lydia followed her husband's advice and took the ring to a jeweler. Luckily, he informed her that he was going to be able to repair it. He had all the equipment needed. Lydia went to the jeweler that same afternoon. It was only a short drive into the town. In addition, she'd called the jewelry store ahead of time and was assured they could easily fix the broken ring at a relatively cheap price. But Lydia wasn't prepared for what the jeweler had to say to her as he inspected it. Lydia was still in shock when she arrived at the jeweler. The latter insisted on inspecting the ring because he seemed to have already seen it somewhere. She was the store's only customer on that day, so when she walked in, the jeweler immediately greeted her with a broad smile on his face. Lydia explained what happened and gave the ring to the employee. He raised an eyebrow when he saw it and proclaimed that he'd seen a ring before, he just couldn't remember where. The jeweler began to ask her about the origin of the ring. Lydia wasn't very proud of this story, but she didn't really have a choice. It was her mom's ring and nothing and no one could change that. Lydia told him the story of how her mother had supposedly gotten it and how it had landed eventually in her arms. But when she mentioned how old her mother was when she stole the ring from her employer, the jeweler arrested her and said there was no way the story was correct. The jeweler seemed to know the origin of the ring and it didn't fit with Lydia's story. Lydia's jaw dropped as he explained why. The jeweler was a connoisseur and noticed right away something was wrong with Lydia's story, or rather Sarah's story. If the story was correct, it meant her mother had stolen the ring in 1952, but the techniques used to make this ring weren't applied until after 1968. This was the first year this ring could have been produced, and it was a far cry from the year Lydia mentioned in her story. And while she was telling this story, the employee suddenly realized. The jeweler now remembered where he'd seen the ring and asked Lydia to wait a few minutes while he went to do some research in his workshop. He was about to tell her the truth. He quickly went to the back and pulled out a small and rather old book. It was a catalog of items they had in the store over the years. The jeweler had the full history of all the items they had in the jewelry store since it opened. He went through a few pages and turned the book over to Lydia. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her mom's ring was among the rings that were on display in the jewelry store. It was shocking news. She was finally going to know the true story. It was her mother's ring, but how? The jeweler claimed this was where he recognized it from. The model had been produced by their store but long before its time, and when he was in the back, he also searched the store archives and made a bizarre discovery that was going to upset Lydia even more and teach her the truth. The jeweler was rather reluctant to tell the story of the ring as he knew the news would completely upset Lydia and perhaps change her mom's idea. This exact ring had been stolen from their store in 1969. He knew it was the exact one because the serial number matched. There was no doubt about it, the facts were there. Lydia couldn't believe what she was hearing. She analyzed the ring several times before accepting the news. Did her mother steal the ring from that store? But why? Then she realized it wasn't possible, her mother couldn't have. But the more she thought about it, the more the story took on meaning. She understood why her mom could have. 1969 was the year of Lydia's birth. Her father had left her mother and she was already strapped for cash. Sarah must have felt a wave of desperation given the circumstances, so she had to do it for her daughter. The story was sad, of course, but it was very serious too. The store clerk had another thing to say, and that was the first positive message. Lydia was very worried about what would happen next. Would the jeweler call the police to report this theft that happened 50 years ago? Was she going to be arrested? The jeweler listened to Lydia's story very carefully and allowed her to keep the ring. The crime had happened so long ago the police wouldn't be able to do anything about it, but even if they did, he had no intention of taking it from her. He realized the sentimental value she had was far greater than any monetary value she'd have paid. Hearing the news made Lydia even sadder. It meant that her mom had to commit theft to sustain her. She felt so saddened that her mom had to go through all these difficult times. But luckily for Lydia, the jeweler allowed her to keep the ring because it was now his store. He even offered to repair the ring and restore it to its original quality for free. Lydia couldn't be happier, but something was still bugging her. What else had her mother had stolen? What other secrets had she kept? Hearing this news from the jeweler, however, didn't change the image she had of her mother. Sarah had always given a lot of love and she had a very happy life by her side. She had to make peace with the fact that there's a lot about her mother she'd never know. But what she knew, and had in fact always known, was that there was nothing her mother wouldn't do for her. And knowing that made this ring even more special. She was grateful to the jeweler for allowing her to keep this wonderful memory.